Today's live show is sponsored by Uffizzi. Stand up your developer platform in minutes with Uffizzi. The Uffizzi platform provides fast provision Kubernetes clusters for all your dev and testing needs. Every engineer gets self-service, sandboxed virtual clusters. Every team can have centralized management of those clusters. It runs on their infrastructure or yours. Uffizzi has deployment support for Helm, Kustomize, Kubernetes Manifest, and even Docker Compose. Their management platform has features such as sleep mode, time-based deletion, and resource quotas for avoiding overspending. Try their free starter tier today by spinning up your first sandbox cluster in under a minute at uffizzi.com. Hello, I'm Bret. This is my live show every Thursday. Welcome. Glad you're here. This is something I've been doing for a long time now. So if you're new, if you're just seeing this show up on YouTube, welcome. Please like and subscribe. All those things that we all always say that's annoying and everyone should know by now. We know how to get the content we want. And I do this live show every week. So this week I am all alone. Sadly, Nirmal, my co-host, is not available. He's in another country. He's overseas. He's somewhere else in the world. I don't know. But it's you and me. We're talking cloud native DevOps. I've got topics. I've got stuff I've talked about in my newsletter lately that I can cover. But this is a time for you to ask me questions. If you're in my courses, ask questions about what you're learning in there. If you're an operations person, if you're actually doing DevOps day to day, if you're thinking about containers or container problems, throw those into chat and we can have a conversation. In case you didn't know, there's a newsletter, which I'm frantically working on getting out this week because I am building a series in my newsletter around the changes to registries, to Docker registries. So here's a link to my newsletter. If you're not on it, it's about an email a week. And that email lately has started to have a section where I talk about one topic. So the purpose of my newsletters is to let you know who's going to be on the show, because we have guests every other week, and who's going to be on the podcast, because those shows get released as podcasts. And then usually a couple other things that I'm doing are releasing new content, new GitHub repo examples of things for DevOps, or it's a topic. And so you can see lately, I've started to write on topics that I'm focused on. And lately I've been hearing, well, really just for years now, but specifically this year is the year that we're getting a new version of the specification for images and registry, known as distribution. So if you're someone who uses containers or someone who doesn't even use containers yet, and welcome, this is what this channel is about. If you're not even using containers and you might use tools like Homebrew, and there's a number of other tools. If you're interested in security, like signing your images, you've heard of something like cosign, or maybe you're considering SBOMs because you're in an enterprise or government and you need larger security practices around ensuring and increasing the integrity of your distributions and your releases, then you might be worried about attestations, SBOMs, signing of images, all these different things. Well, if you're at all interested in any of that, then you will want to check out this. I think it's going to be a 3-parter newsletter that I've been doing for the last couple of weeks. So this last week's was this one, talking largely about I titled it One Registry to Rule Them All, because container images, like your Docker images that we've all been using for a decade now, that solution behind that is getting a sort of it's evolving to officially support different types of data other than container images. Now, technically, this has been happening for years. We've actually already had this support. If you've ever uploaded a Helm chart, that usually goes in a registry. If you've ever dealt with Homebrew, since 2021, Homebrew has installed Mac tools. In case you're not a Mac user, Homebrew is for Mac and now Linux to install tools on your system and programs. And that tool now installs things through the image registry over at GitHub. So the GitHub CR container registry is actually how you're getting your latest Postgres or your latest version of a command line tool that's your favorite command line tool. So all of that stuff is starting to move to the registry specification or the registry storage. So coming soon, we might possibly have one type of artifact storage for all the things we need to distribute. When it comes to servers, maybe even clients, like Homebrew is just really for desktops, right? So Homebrew, since it's using that, it technically is not a server thing. And so we're not talking about S3, because S3, even though it's a very similar idea in storage, things like S3 are a little too generic, and they don't have some of the parameters that the Docker registry, now known as the OCI registry spec, that specification has some very simple attributes that allow it to be expandable and support things beyond its original goal of images. So now we've got, I think I'm counting over a dozen different types of data, some security related, some other tooling related to images, some things like Homebrew that have nothing to do with container images, that don't use container images. And they're all starting to move towards the OCI spec and the registries that we all know, like ECR, GitLab, GitHub Container Registry, Azure Container Registry. All these different registries are eventually going to start supporting all these different artifact types. And there's a plot, there's a story of how we got here, where are we now, what's the status, where's the future going. And so check out my newsletter if you want to catch up on this. So last week, I talked about sort of the how did we get here, or the history of what's known as the distribution specification. And that's how we store our container images. Well, now we can store things like volumes in there. And I actually created a tool a few years ago, but we're probably going to end up having a better version of that tool come out that uses this new type of metadata to describe what you're storing. But there's all these other things too. I mentioned SBOMs. We've talked about different security stuff like security signing, and things like Flux or Tecton. Other tools, GitOps tools, are now storing whether it's YAML or JSON or whatever they need to determine how they deploy software. Those are stored in registries. One of the big reasons that that's all starting to happen is that not all production systems that need their artifacts, not all those systems have access to Git. They don't necessarily have access to GitHub or GitLab or some sort of Git storage. But if they're doing anything in containers, they definitely have access to a container registry. So since we already have this registry sitting there available to devs, to our CI solutions, to our servers in production, and to the world, since those already exist and they have an API that's expandable, they have now become the proposed standard for all artifact storage, and probably in the future will be the way we distribute all packages. In fact, if you could predict out 5 years, we might be in a future where even legacy package tooling, I'm just going to call it legacy, but apt, yum, Windows MSIs, like think of WinGit, think of all the things that we've all distributed storage artifacts where they're typically built somewhere, pushed to a storage system where they're read-only, and then they have versions, and they probably have SHA hashing to guarantee that that's exactly what you mean to install, and then we download them somewhere, right? And there's this huge CDN network all over the world, and we've done that for NPM, we've done it for apt, we've done it for every programming language out there has their own package manager now, and they're all different standards. They're all different APIs. So there's a potential, and possibly the future idea here is that the OCI, which originally was just for containers, is going to become, that specification is going to become the way we centralize into one giant storage system to rule them all. And you might store in one registry in your data center. You might eventually store your security SBOMs and attestations to define what's in your packages, the signing of all of the things you need to sign to guarantee that that is the original stuff and that it hasn't been changed, plus obviously your container images, but anything else, maybe apt yum packages that you might need on the host operating system for those Linux distributions, maybe the npm and Maven packages and the Python pip packages. Like, imagine all those that you might need for building your images, when you do your Docker builds. Imagine all those coming from the same registry, and we're going to all have to build new clients. We're going to have to expand the current CLI tooling to talk to OCI registries. But once that happens, we'll now start to see people providing OCI registries as an option, such as Helm, which previously it was storing it in a certain way in basically web servers way back in version 1 and 2 of Helm. And then version 3 brought forth the OCI option of storing your Helm charts in registries. And they didn't enforce it. They didn't make you do it. They just gave it as an option in case you didn't have the Helm web server option. And now OCI is like the preferred way, basically, with Helm. And that's becoming a trend in other tooling all around the ecosystem. So, in case you didn't know all that, that's my one big thing to talk about today, because I'm literally writing the next newsletter now, and I will send that out later today. So go check that out, Bret.news. You can go sign up for that free newsletter. And I think it's going to end up being a 3-parter. I think that today's we'll talk more about the specification, what 1.1 of the specification will mean for us. And then maybe next week's will be some of the clients out there, some of the tools that are all starting to store their data in OCI registries. All right, let me check on chat, see how everyone's doing today. While I'm looking at chat real quick, if you are using a registry today to store something other than container images, put it in chat. Let us know in chat what you're using registries for now, besides containers. Hello everyone. Hello, Dan. I see your questions. Dan, I'll get to your question in a minute about Argo. On this registry topic, that's a great question on one registries compared to JFrog Artifactory. So I'm not an Artifactory expert, but this is what I believe. This is what I believe to be true. So JFrog is one of the few companies that create a private, not a standard, but a private product, a private tool, right, that you have to pay for, that essentially, my understanding is it runs all these different types of package management systems, whether it's a OCI registry, whether it's an NPM registry, whether it's an apt and yum pack, plus just regular file storage. It does all of those, right? So the goal of the OCI registry specification is so that we eventually, maybe you would have an option that you don't have to do that you wouldn't have to run in your own JFrog Artifactory proprietary. And really one of the things that JFrog does for you is all these different package solutions have open source options, but who wants to run 5 or 10 different storage systems and web APIs, right? Nobody really wants to do that. These systems are largely just web storage systems, and they're just riffs on the same idea of how can we upload and download binaries and tarballs from a web server HTTPS interface. And no one's really agreed on a universal standard. And even though S3 is a very common thing in the industry, and other people have sort of created S3-like, S3 technically is still proprietary, controlled by AWS, and it's fairly static. Like, it's not a specification that is evolving over time rapidly and innovating in a way to store anything other than just the standard files that it does. So OCI is something that it's a Linux Foundation funded project. It is something that they're interested in getting the entire industry of tooling together, which is why it's taken years now for this to happen. So I feel like even though we've had lots of other things out there, like OCI is the right place at the right time, and we already have registries everywhere, and most of us don't have private S3 or private apt package managers. With JFrog Artifactory, it's a great sort of tool to solve all the problems at once. But the reality is, as an industry, we shouldn't all have to buy a JFrog Artifactory to manage all of our artifacts, right? We shouldn't need a proprietary solution just to do the bare minimum. And so I think this standard is going to allow us, if you just want to use open source, something like Harbor, which is rapidly supporting a lot of this stuff in Harbor, or if you want to just run the official Docker registry that's in the distribution spec, or if you want to use Docker Hub or GitHub Container Registry or GitHub Enterprise Server or GitLab Enterprise Server, like if you want to just do all these things, you will have the storage you need, and you can choose to store your packages in that way, regardless of what package type it is, assuming the client tools like the apt command or the npm command, assuming those tools get updated to then support this as a way to pull packages and upload packages, then you'll have that option and you won't have to buy a JFrog Artifactory. I know lots of companies where they get a requirement to store RPMs for Ruby and they have to store them themselves. So they are kind of forced, because they need container images, they need artifacts, they need some general web storage, they need npm and Ruby and maybe some apps. They end up doing Artifactory because it's way too much of a project for them to install each one of these project web server tools individually. So Artifactory is the easy button there. And so if you have it today, or if you still think you need that today, that's the right solution today. In a few years, once we've seen a lot of client tools adapt to the OCI specification change, once we see whether the industry really starts to support it outside of the container ecosystem, then we'll know, yes, you can skip Artifactory in a lot of cases, and you can just install Harbor or one of the other OCI registries. That remains to be seen. So today it doesn't solve, this specification change isn't going to solve the problem that Artifactory solves. But maybe eventually. One of the real goals here is that the industry has a single universal storage system that can store all types of artifacts, whether they're tiny little JSON files that happen to be a signature to ensure that your packages or whatever you're storing there are safe and they've been signed by an accredited, trusted source, or something like an SBOM that's maybe a little bit bigger. Maybe it's a couple hundred K in size of JSON that lists all the different software binaries and files inside whatever you're storing. Or if it's something huge like a 10 gig volume that you've decided to upload as a backup to OCI storage. And the nice thing about OCI storage is, since it's read-only, you can't upload an image with a SHA hash, and you can't just fake replacing that image with a different image that has maybe bad data in it, but it replaces that same SHA hash. That technically can't work. So you've got this scenario where it might be a good backup solution if you don't already have another backup solution. That's why I actually created a little tool a couple years ago called Backup. So this tool was a concept it's just a simple little shell script, and all it does is use Docker commands to copy a volume's data into an image and commit that image, and then upload that, and then you can upload that image just like an image for a container, but the only thing really in this image is your volume data. And this simple idea became an official Docker extension. So now if you look up on Hub, if you go to Hub and you click on extensions, you can actually search through these extensions, and one of them somewhere in here, I don't know if I can find it. There's a lot of them now, but there's one in here that's for volume backups, essentially volume copy, moving volumes around between hosts, and it's made by Docker, and they sort of based it on my idea. We've also got something called ORAS. So ORAS is an official CNCF project that provides a single command line utility and a Go library in case you want to make it programmatically, but it makes a client tool that you can upload and download any file type to a registry and store cat images, store whatever you want, right? Inside of a container registry using the existing registry specifications. So they're showing here the idea that you could put in WASM modules for WebAssembly. You might put in, that's Harbor. You might put in Helm charts. You might put in other artifact types in there. I'm not sure what all those logos are. But that's the idea with ORAS. And that's been around for a while, years now. And maybe, and that tool is getting changed to support this new specification. So if you're curious about this stuff, there is a couple of repos. So all of this stuff is under open containers. This is the OCI place. This is where all the standards are kept for how a Docker image works, how a Docker container runs, the runtime specification, the distribution specification, and the image specification. So those three, that trilogy essentially allows all these different tools and all these different servers and runtimes and registry types for them to all agree upon something, and that's the specification number. So for example, if you go into distribution and you look at their releases, you'll see that we've been on 1.0 since the beginning, right? Since the specification, I think it was like 2018, where we officially said we have a 1.0, right? And now we're in the release stages, the release candidate stages of the 1.1, which will officially it gives us a few extra options and fields that we can fill out. And if you're curious, read my newsletter. We'll talk all about that this week and next week. So let me see if we have any more questions on that before we change to Dan's question. I see Dan's patiently waiting. Do a poll. Can I do a poll in start a poll? Okay, I can do a poll. Do you store other data types in or just container images? I'm going to start a poll here in the chat. That's actually my first time I've done that. So the poll here is, do you just store container images in your registry, or do you also store other things like Helm charts? Are you experimenting with signing and S-bombing your images? Are you experimenting with that? I'm curious if anyone out there is doing that. Yeah, the Docker volume plugins, those could be stored in there as well. Planning on storing your templates for Docker stacks in there, but that would just be from scratch container. Yeah, with stuff in it probably. So yeah, you can. That's the thing is we have overloaded the image media type to store many other things inside of a tarball that then has a manifest that describes it, right? So that's been happening all along. That's how I made my little volumes plugin hack thing, like not volumes plugin, but volume storage. Is I just made an image. I'm making an image that puts files in the image. That's an easy button because I don't have to create my own client. I can just use Docker commit to take a container and save it to an image. If you've ever used the Docker commit command, it's a pretty handy one, making a new image from an existing container. And so I just do that. But what we're seeing is these other clients, like some of the SBOM clients, like Cosign for signing images, the Helm command, these other client libraries and tools are now offering a different way to store things in these tarballs. And what this image specification, the 1.1, is it's going to officially allow us to now upload things that aren't in a blob, that aren't in a tarball. So we could directly upload something that's not wrapped in layers, right? So it's a little bit less of a nested problem and allows us to do things like just straight up upload an SBOM without needing to fake the API a little bit. It also, the way I understand this is the other thing that's happening is we're getting a refers API, and I'll send out a talk on this in my newsletter. So again, jump on the newsletter. You'll get all the information this week, but there's a great talk. Brendan Mitchell goes through this. He's one of the maintainers of OCI, and he has a great talk that describes the details of this new API that would allow you to have all these other things refer to some other thing. So you could have an image that has your app, your app in the container image, and then all these other separate manifests and media artifact types that are all referring back to that image. And maybe that's your SBOM, maybe that's multiple types of SBOMs because there's competing formats. Maybe it's signing or multiple signatures over time or multiple SBOMs over time because you scan an image and you want to store the result. And you do that every month, right? So you keep them in history. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe you come up with something new like Helm charts and you want to describe Helm charts or sign your Helm charts. I don't even know if that's a thing with Helm charts, if you can sign it. But that's maybe if that's possible, then that's going to be how this new refer API makes it easier for us to keep our registries clean. I think what's this is going to end up happening is when you go to like Harbor today, if you use Harbor, the open source image registry today, it already has a lot of this in there where you can see different types of information coming out of your registry in different web views. And one of the things that this 1.1 is going to do for us is it's going to help us make cleaner client UIs where your UI only shows you the things you care about. So imagine a future where it's all stored in one registry, but maybe when you go to, let's say, GitHub Container Registry, you go to the image tab and you only see images and their tags, right? And then you click on the SBOMs and then you only see things about SBOMs. And then you click on NPM and you only see things about NPM packages. Technically, the backend storage is all the same, but on the front client side, we're now able to discern based on these different artifact types in the API. We're able to figure out, they only care about SBOM, so I'm only going to show them those, right? Whereas today, what happens is you go to your registry and you end up seeing a lot of tags and other things showing up in your image tag list that are just it looks like a bunch of gobbledygook. It's a bunch of SHA hashes. And so that experience isn't great. And that's part of the problem that we're trying to fix, so that we're not implementing this different for each registry and everyone's different and everyone has a different approach to it. And that was not sustainable, really. In fact, if you do this today, if you go and use some of these tools like Cosign or ORAS or some of the other ones, if you did this even 2022 and you did it on 4 different registries, the way you would see that data in the registry would look a little bit different on the web UI or the client UI or whatever. You would see that different across all the different registries. And so there's not universal consistency on the way this data is displayed. So I think that's part of the way we're going to fix it with this new specification. A Docker plugin, I don't I mean, to Docker plugin, I don't even know how Docker plugins relate to container registries. I don't even know if Docker plugins store in registries. Do they? Maybe they do. And if they do, they're probably just a media type of image, a standard. They just kind of wrap inside of a container. Maybe they have a scratch image and they technically build an image and they have all the config data like it's a real image and they just extract out the binaries. That's probably what they do because Docker plugins have been around for a very long time. So they were way before this discussion around artifacts even began, I feel like. All right, I'm going to scroll back up. So Dan's first question, going back to a new topic, setting up Argo CD. You wish you'd attended my live classes. Do I recommend Helm or Customize with Argo CD? They both are fine. My attitude on the difference is you always should use Customize first. Unless you're an expert in both and your team is an expert in both, use Customize until you can't. I personally don't use Helm, even with complicated projects, until I'm going to have to deliver that software to other teams for them to install. And I want to give them a clean interface, essentially, abstraction. And with Helm, you get the Helm command line. So you can make a chart with Helm command line. You can push and pull charts with Helm command lines. You can list charts with Helm command lines. You don't really get any of that with Customize because Customize YAML is just YAML. It doesn't have a templating engine. It just uses overrides, and it has a couple of neat little functions in it that allow it easier for things like overriding images and whatnot. But I find Customize much easier to learn and understand because it is, again, just a few extra pieces of functionality on top of YAML, whereas Helm is a complete templating system that generates proper YAML when you output it. So I find Helm to be heavier weight, and a lot of times, for example, in Helm, you always need a values file. And that values file can get quite long and busy and a little confusing quickly. Whereas with Customize, if you have a pretty standard application and you've built the Customize YAML, which is, again, just regular Kubernetes YAML, and you build a Kubernetes manifest, and then you just need to override, let's say, the image tag, and that's the only thing you need to change between dev, test, and prod, then the only thing you're creating is a single, well, technically, a single file, a single customization YAML file that maybe has 5 lines of YAML in it. So it's very minimal, very easy. And so that is not an Argo thing. Argo can use both equally and just as well. With Argo right now, we don't yet have the ability in Argo to pull from an OCI registry to get, I think it's to get the Helm charts. Actually, that's not true. You can get Helm charts through Argo today, which you can't get through Helm today that you can with Flux, is you can't store the actual GitOps configuration. Like in Argo, it's application sets. You can't store those in OCI registries. Flux, a different tool than Argo, Flux allows that, which means that you don't need to have production servers talk to Git. With Argo CD, which is my favorite, Argo CD still requires that anywhere you've installed Argo on servers, that technically has to be able to reach out to Git repos where you're storing your GitOps data. And that works for most people. So if your production servers have access to GitHub or GitLab or wherever you store your Git repos, then you're fine. Use Argo. But I would say try customization first. Use that. I have an example. So I have in this, Dan, I will send you this example. Now this is an organization, Dan, that I use in my actual workshop, the GitHub Actions plus Argo workshop. But so I'm just giving this to you saying there's not a lot of documentation in it because the documentation comes with the course. But this is still useful. And if you go down to the repo list and you look at K8s, Wordsmith K8s. So that is the single repo that describes the multiple parts of the application in Kubernetes customization YAML. So if you ever look at customize, you usually have a base, which is just standard Kubernetes YAML, and that describes all those different parts of your app. And then you override that for each environment. So I have an environments directory, and in there would be a directory for each environment I'm deploying this app to. And so in each environment, I may only need to override a couple of values. So this would be the equivalent in Helm of using a different values file. So think of this as like my values file. And in there, it's very short. And all I'm doing is saying, I want to override the image tags. So basically go to that YAML in the base directory. See how I'm saying use the base directory here. And then send all that Kubernetes YAML to Kubernetes. But in this case, add a config map. This is the neat little feature that Kustomize has. Give me a config map and add this file to it. This is basically my SQL seeding of a database server. And then for the images, go look for any image with this name anywhere in that YAML and replace the tag with this one. And I teach that in the course. That's how we learn how to update this. Is we actually create a little GitHub action that after you've made your new images, it will automatically create a pull request to update this tag. And you can see that actually over here. So you can see that this is basically an automated robot PR that goes in and changes the tag from one tag to a different tag based on an image being built. So hopefully that'll get you started. For everyone else, if you're not aware, I have a course called Automate Your Deployments. We're going to announce when the next one is later this year. So we don't have the dates set yet for when this is going to happen. But if you're interested in this course, this is a live course. Just go to that URL. I sent it to you in text in the chat, and you can go sign up there, and you'll get updates when I launch a new course date for us to have another round of students. All right. Great question. All right, I got another question here. Mirdad, sorry if I mispronounced that. You have VMware ESXi on-premise. How should you install Kubernetes for enterprise environment? Should I make some VMs, and how should I assign them to workstation? Rancher is good, or should I use KubeSpray? Well, that's a lot of questions. That's going to be hard for me to answer all that. So there is no perfect Kubernetes distribution. I mean, what you're really, I think, asking here, I mean, VMs are just VMs. You don't have to install Kubernetes on VMs. You can install Kubernetes on real physical hosts if you want to. But if you're a shop that's used to making VMs with ESXi, that's fine. Do that. And there's no specific design. Obviously, if it's Kubernetes, it's going to be running lots of applications. So you're going to need lots of storage, lots of CPU, lots of RAM. But that's based on your application requirements. So you're going to have to size those VMs for your Kubernetes cluster based on your application requirements. And so to start with, you need at least 3, right? You need 3 nodes in Kubernetes, and that's going to be the control plane spread out across 3 different nodes for redundancy. And so most organizations will have 3 different control plane nodes that don't run any applications. It just runs the management stuff. And then you have other nodes that run your applications. So for most organizations that are trying to scale up and create a true enterprise Kubernetes solution, they will create a minimum of 5 nodes. 3 nodes for the control plane that just need a minimum set of resources like 4 gig of RAM, maybe 8 gig of RAM to start with, and then just enough storage to run all the control plane stuff, your core DNS server, maybe some monitoring tools, the etcd database to store your Kubernetes data. All those things are going to run across the control plane. Your controllers, your scheduler, all that stuff. And then you're going to have the dedicated nodes, the worker nodes for your apps. And those, if you have at least 2, then there at least can be some sort of redundancy for your apps. And so a minimum there of 2. And those would be larger VMs, because I'm assuming you have lots of apps you need to deploy. If you don't have lots of container apps, you don't need Kubernetes. So if you just have 10 or 20 containers to run, just run Docker on a couple of servers. Like, you don't need a full-fledged Kubernetes solution. But if you're planning on running 50, 100, 200 containers, 500 containers or more, like, that's when Kubernetes really shines. So build out the Kubernetes. Doesn't matter which one you use. Rancher is a very popular one, but it's also a little complicated to get it all configured the way that Rancher prefers. A smaller, easier to get started with distribution might be Microkates from Ubuntu, or I know that VMware has Tanzu and other container options. You might look at those. If you're already running VMware, you're already paying for VMware, I definitely would consider their solutions as one of your primary options, because you then have a single vendor who's building your VMs and designing the container solutions on top. So you're going to get some synergy there between all the other VMware tools. So I would definitely consider that. The reason to maybe go Rancher would be is if you can't do everything in ESXi, but you want centralized control. So one of the things that Rancher specializes in is you have Kubernetes in Azure, you have Kubernetes in AWS, you have Kubernetes in ESXi on-prem using Tanzu or something else, and you have all these different places, and you need a centralized management. So you can have Rancher manage all those, or you can also install Rancher's Kubernetes version with their RKE install tools, and that's a different distribution. But Rancher, the GUI, the centralized management solution, can do a lot of that management for you. So Rancher can be easier to use, but also more complicated because it's it's turned into this enterprise thing, right? I definitely don't recommend things like, if this is your first time and you're asking me these questions, don't do kubeadmin, don't do kubespray, only because those are vanilla upstream tools that will require more work for you. So they tend to be for more people that are designing entire data centers, in my opinion, and they're going to have a dozen or 3 dozen different Kubernetes clusters. That's when I recommend more upstream tools. The distribution tools that are actually official distributions like Tanzu and Rancher and Microkates, those are more for, I feel like for end users. They have more fancy abilities. They are able to include a lot of the third-party tooling built in. For example, when you use Rancher, you can go in and pick recipes they have for other things to install, like monitoring and logging and storage and whatnot. But these are just opinions. There is no wrong or right way. There's no wrong or right way to create the VMs, and there's no wrong or right distribution for you. It really depends on, do you need support contracts? Do you need a company that you pay for support to help you when it breaks? Or do you want a purist open source model where you only use open source and you're going to have to support it all yourself? Those are a lot of decisions there that I don't know. I don't have the answers to, because only you have those answers. So good questions. Dan's back with another question. Why am I getting error response from the daemon git registry, Docker, remote error, TLS handshake failure, out of sync, Docker's version repo? I have no idea, Dan. I've never even heard of that error. The first thing that makes me wonder is, do you have a proxy between you and the web server that proxy is getting in your way? Like if you have a transparent proxy on your network and you're running a Docker command locally and it's expecting to talk directly to Docker registry, but there's this transparent TLS proxy in the middle, you can have problems and I'm not sure if that's your error, but that's the first thing I would ask is, do you have proxies? Because it sounds like there's a proxy not configured correctly with your Docker client, which can use proxies, but you have to do things to Docker. And that's in the docs. The Docker docs have, if you just search Docker proxy, you'll find in the docs a bunch of stuff on that. So on the poll, the poll is so far 73% of everyone just stores container images. Cool. All right. Paulo. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Since the tree is no longer maintained, can you recommend some Kubernetes security best practices tools that I can implement with CI to validate my manifest Helm charts? Maybe something like Kyverno. Well, Kyverno is a policy engine. I don't know if Kyverno actually is a YAML scanner, but look up, there's several, honestly. So there is, one of them is kubeconform. So go look that one up. And kubeconform is a YAML scanner. Also, Trivy does many things, but one of the things that Trivy now does is it can scan clusters as well as YAML. So see how it says here, scanner, what Trivy can find is infrastructure as code, issues, and misconfigurations, and it's doing more and more stuff now. So you can actually scan a cluster, and you can scan your images, obviously, for vulnerabilities, and you can add this config. So let's see if they have. I'm not sure if that's going to be a config, but that's another one I would look at. And then there's one more. And that's Kubescape. So go check Kubescape out. And these tools overlap. So you're going to have to figure out which one you like more. Kubeconform is probably the narrowest scope because Kubeconform really is, as far as I know, today is only a YAML scanner to make sure that your manifest will work. And then Trivy is known for being an image scanner, but now has continued to expand its capabilities to do more and more things. And then Kubescape is another one there. And there are other ones as well. But those are the first three that I would look at that I'm the most familiar with. So hopefully that helps. Good questions. Yeah, it's a real shame that the tree's shutting down. I just learned about that this week, so. Oh yeah, you have Zots, the new one registry in CNCF. Yeah. Zots is nice. I don't like that Zots doesn't support Docker images. It just, why? It's it's one of those things where their entire purpose is to be OCI compliant. I get it, but every other registry in the world today supports Docker images, the media type, and they only support OCI images. Now, you can still use Docker tools to build it, but you have to go the extra mile to make sure you're building for OCI and it's a string of text. It's just, I don't know. I get it. They wanted to be different. They didn't just, we already have other registries like the distribution, Harbor, Kraken. I mean, there's just a bunch. So I get it. But I would be more excited about Zots if it was backwards compatible, so that it didn't literally break everything I try to deploy to it by default. But that's cool that you're using Zots. I don't have any clients or anyone that I'm advising that has switched to Zots yet. So I'm curious if you love it, if you hate it, if you have issues. I mean, I don't know if you've used other registries like Harbor, but what we're talking about is a new registry option. We're talking about Zots here. And what it does is it feels like it's trying to be the reference implementation of the OCI specification for distribution, aka registries. It feels like that, which means before we had the OCI, we just had Docker. And Docker, up until even now, when you build a Docker image, it is a media type of Docker image, not OCI image. And that's because Docker tends to be ahead of OCI. They tend to implement new things, and they were around before, so we had the legacy aspect. So when you do Docker build, you're actually producing a Docker image, not an OCI image. They are almost entirely the same, but there are a few nuances and differences in those images. But your registry has to be able to support that media type. Now, since every registry outside of Zot, every other registry supports both the OCI image type and the Docker image type for backwards compatibility. And then Zot came out and said, we're going to support only OCI specification, which does not include the legacy Docker image. And that's fine. That's totally their decision. But it is the reason I will not use it. Just because I would have to literally change every other script, command. I'd have to change everything to make sure that I'm only producing OCI specification resources, and that's just a lot of work for no real benefit. It seems like bike shedding or yak shaving, essentially. But it doesn't mean it's not a cool product. You just have to understand the caveat of, you're going to have to rebuild all your stuff probably. Anton, what's up? Greetings. Any comments on freezing Kubernetes legacy package repositories? No comment. I mean, we're moving forward, right? We continually change URLs and get rid of the legacy stuff in the Kubernetes world from the day one Kubernetes. We're 10 years into Kubernetes, so it's time for us to sort of evolve and scale. And I like these. I like that they're doing all this work to clean house and prepare for the future. It does suck that it affects a lot of us in a way where we have to do a lot of work with no real benefit. But that is the pace of standards and of, keeping these projects healthy and I would say clean. So I'm a fan of the work they're doing. I agree with it. It does create work for the rest of us, but oh, you create the plugins from a root FS. Okay. So yeah, there's going to be just one artifact, not a bunch of layers. Yeah, I haven't looked at the manifest actually for a plugin, so I was guessing on that on Secu. Yeah, Conrad, sadly. Yeah. I just found this out myself, and I actually found out because I was going to go look at it for using it on a project, and then realized, they've essentially it's going to go archive, and it's a real shame. I guess the commercial company, they were on this show, I think last year, and sadly, I guess the commercial entity behind it didn't work out, so they're not going to be able to maintain the open source anymore. Yeah, good on you, Dan, for figuring out the cipher suit. Yeah, I did see that on the tree. If you There was people putting in issues actually in the last couple of weeks saying, "Hey, I'm trying to use this server API and it's failing." And they said, "Well, you only have to do it in offline mode because that's only because we shut down the servers essentially." So that does suck. Yeah, Nubo, I definitely know that Zot is still. Yeah, you figured it out. But Zot is they are trying. They're actually Zot is trying to follow this 1.1 release pretty closely. So my understanding is whenever there's new even release clients that they're trying to update, I haven't looked at their versioning. I didn't realize that they're going to call it 2.0. Um, yeah. Anyway, that's pretty cool. Dan's asking about how do you handle um, mm, secrets? In my Docker file, how do I handle secrets? I need a pat for GitLab. Is there a new mount command for secrets in the Docker file? Um, no, you definitely don't put secrets in your image, right? So you don't want to build them in, and as you understand that you got to mount them. But if you're talking about, I mean, if you're talking about secrets, they're generally inputted as environment variables, right? So there's nothing inherently insecure about an environment variable. The reason that Kubernetes and Docker Swarm support essentially environment settings as files is just in case your environment variables leak into logs. That's real. There's nothing necessarily in terms of your application accessing environment variables versus files. The other thing that files have an advantage of is that they can have permissions. That's not really an issue, though, in containers, right? Because usually in containers, the exploit, the way that someone gets into the container, if you're worried about revealing data, the way they get in is usually through the app itself, not from like root on the host. Because if they can do that, they can get anything. If they're root on the host, they own all the data, all the environment variables, all the files. So your secrets are exposed regardless in that case. But if they're coming through the app, let's say that there's some way that they can somehow get a CLI or a shell in your app's container, they're going to have access. They're probably going to be in the permissions of whatever that app's running as, which means they're still going to have permissions to the environment variables and the file system, wherever those secrets might be on the file system. So from my point of view, the difference between those two ways, there's really only three ways, right? To keep your secrets. You either keep them as environment variables, which is the gold standard. Everybody can support that. Every application supports that. Or files like config maps or swarm secrets. Not config maps, but secrets, which are essentially config maps with a slightly different set of API tools around them. But so there's files in the file system that store secrets. There's environment variables that store secrets. And then you keep your secrets somewhere else, and your app has to know how to go get those. They might be in a database. They might be in some sort of API like Vault, or they might be in a cloud secrets API. But your app, the problem with that one is your app has to know how to go get those. So you have to build that into the app itself, which is why most people don't do that. And they opt for one of the other two options, environment variables or files on the hard drive, which would store the secrets via the secret stuff. So it's really up to you whether you use environments or files. If you decide for your team that you want your programs to only look for files, then you can make that a standard by convention in your team. And that's a little bit more secure, safer, really, than environment variables. But the reality is you're always going to end up with other applications that you have to run that don't support the file system. So you're going to have to put those secrets in environment variables for those other apps. So trying to avoid any environment variable secrets it's kind of a lost cause, because even things like Postgres or MySQL, if you go look at the images in Docker Hub, those images can technically support file-based secrets, but the reason they can support that is because there's a shell script that runs before the SQL Server starts, and it will take those those files, if they exist. It'll take the files, turn them into environment variables, so that the SQL Server can ingest them. So you're not really saving anything by putting them in as files, because the wrapper script that's in the entry point is going to make those secrets into environment variables anyway. So do whatever's easiest, man. Environment variables are fine. Just realize that your logging system, and most of them do, need to look out for secrets if they ever see them, and then obfuscate them, remove them, right? Redact them, essentially, so that you don't have those secrets in your logs. And most logging systems, including things like GitHub Actions, it's pretty smart at making sure that you don't accidentally leak secrets into your GitHub Action logs. And there's actually tools out there that are used by a lot of the logging systems to detect what looks like secrets and just redact them. So I don't sweat the small stuff like that. If I have a team that wants to go hardcore and wants to make these file-based secrets all over the place, and they want to program that into their apps, so their apps look for files first and then sort of fall back to environment variables if they don't find the files where they expect them, that's totally cool. Like, I will totally support that and work with them on that next level effort. But a lot of teams just don't have the time to rewrite and do all that work to support file-based secrets. Getting to your question, if you're just running Docker, yes, you have to just bind mount in the files. I think if you're bind mounting in files to get secrets because you're not using Swarm or Kubernetes, then just use environment variables. I mean, I don't really see an advantage to storing the secrets on the hard drive in files and then bind mounting those in on Docker. It's just, to me, easier that when you're deploying, you just store them all in environment variables. And it is what it is. I mean, look, every single customer I've ever worked with has environment variable secrets, every one of them. I've never worked with somebody on containers that doesn't have at least one container running with environment variable secrets. So let's not pretend that the world isn't running on environment variable secrets. They're there and they're fine. That's a good question. Yeah, Toby is talking about, like, that's one of the options. A secrets manager provided by your cloud service and use a shim like secrets in it to inject into the container. And that's essentially what I was just saying. That is a wrapper script, sidecar, a init container, whatever. You're essentially removing the responsibility of going to the API to get the secret from your app itself. You're now adding another requirement, meaning you have to have this other thing that goes and gets the API secret, pulls it down, and then puts it into a format your app supports, which is almost certainly environment variables. So whether you have a operator doing this in Kubernetes, because there's lots of them, there's a great one called, if we're talking about Kubernetes right now, if you look at the external secrets operator, this is probably the one that I would use by default. If I'm not using sealed secrets, which is a separate conversation, but sealed secrets is great for small projects. I like using it in small projects when everyone's very familiar with Git and we use Git to store everything. We use sealed secrets for that. And then if I didn't want to use sealed secrets, I wanted to use something else, whether it's Vault, a cloud API, something else, I would then use the external secrets operator. And the nice thing about this operator is it has all these providers. So essentially what you can do is you can have a single operator and controller inside of your cluster and then support many different secret backends based on your application requirements. And the cool thing here is that if you're a big enough company, you might have multiple secret providers. Some teams might be using the Azure Secrets API. Other ones might be using Vault, and still other ones might be using something else. And like GitLab or GitHub or something. So this allows you to have a single operator and simplify your YAML a little bit in configuration. And then per application, the team can come to you and say, hey, we need to deploy this application on your Kubernetes cluster, and we happen to use Google Cloud Secret Manager. And you can support that just through this plugin model, this provider model. And so anyway, I learned about this last year at KubeCon, and I thought it was a really great idea. And the team behind it is doing good work. So if you're interested in that, check that out. I'll put this one in chat. But Toby is great. That's a great one. That's pointing out that you can do that, right? You can have wrapper scripts or external tooling go and get your secrets for you. And that is definitely used a lot. But one of the things that I am sensitive of is that I don't want to tell people they have to do that, right? If you're a team that's relatively young in your security game and you don't have a bunch of external secret storage systems, you can still use Kubernetes to store those secrets. Granted, they're only in Kubernetes or Swarm. If you're using Swarm, you can still use Swarm to store those secrets. But of course, you have to have somewhere else to store them as well, right? Like you have to have something like Vault or some sort of 1Password or something inside your team where you sort of store the master copy, and then you're injecting that into Kubernetes somewhere when you need it. The cool thing about the external secrets operator is that it allows you to keep all the secrets where they already are today, regardless of what technology or tool you've committed, and then use Kubernetes for all of them. And I think that's a pretty cool, flexible approach. But only go this if you have those external secret providers already. When new teams come to me and they're just getting ready to start Kubernetes and they don't already have secrets as a centralized storage system, we end up having a conversation, and the answer always depends. We have a conversation around, do you wish you had Vault or a centralized storage system for all your secrets? Some teams I like 1Password. I think 1Password for developers and infrastructure is really cool. Did you know 1Password has a Kubernetes operator as well? Did you know that the external secrets operator also supports 1Password? And the cool thing about 1Password is you can use it for your own personal secrets, for your team's human secrets, and then also for your Kubernetes and infrastructure secrets. So I kind of have leaned into 1Password because Vault is not meant for humans, right? Like Vault is meant for robot secrets, not for like my Google login secret. It's a lot. I'm not even sure I want all these secret tools, right? So I've kind of leaned into 1Password. I've worked with several teams now on projects where we only use 1Password. And there are pros and cons. It's not perfect, but you make separate vaults and then you put things in that vault and you give permissions to people. And it's nice because you can technically use 1Password anywhere now, at the CLI, in your browser, on your Mac and Windows machines, now in Kubernetes. I can use it in the shell. I can use it in Visual Studio Code. 1Password will actually go into Visual Studio Code and find my secrets and even replace them if I want to with environment variables so that I don't accidentally store secrets inside of my code. Anyway, 1Password is getting kind of great for developers. So if you haven't checked out all of their other tooling, they've got a lot. It's not just for your browser human secrets. In fact, let me just pull that up. And one of the things they have is called 1Password Connect. And 1Password Connect is this separate product that you put in your data center or in your infrastructure, and think of it as like a password proxy between your infrastructure and 1Password servers. So it sits there and retrieves the secrets on behalf of your infrastructure when they need them. And it allows you to essentially outsource. I think that one of the real reasons this is happening is so that, in case your Kubernetes cluster needs a secret every second, that it's not polling the 1Password online APIs every second. That essentially there's now this proxy in the middle that stores those keys temporarily and acts as a cache so that when your containers all spin up and you have 100 different container replicas and they all need that Twitter API key, that they go through the Connect server and it just delivers it all at once. It caches it, and it only has to talk to 1password.com one time to get the key and cache it. Anyway, if you didn't know that about 1Password, definitely go check that stuff out. I think it's, for developers, it's kind of become the right mix of machine keys as well as human keys with all the right tooling. You'll see they have like CI/CD integrations. They even have a VS Code. Oops. I don't know how I zoomed in there. They have a VS Code option here. So you can go to the marketplace and you'll see this. And this adds some extra functionality for managing and using secrets inside of VS Code. That's pretty slick. They have a CLI that you can use. For me, what I'm able to do is I'm able to use 1Password secrets for a lot of my command line tools that require me to pass in a password, like the GitHub command line or the Git command line or the Docker command line. I can store all those in 1Password, and it wraps my shell so that I can basically not have to keep my keys in all these config files in plain text. I can keep them secure in 1Password, and it will dynamically inject those at the shell when my command line tools need them. That's a pretty cool feature as well. So I recommend it. So Dan, you're talking about when you're building and you need to inject a secret at build time. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, you're just gonna let me know if I didn't answer your question, Dan. Like I'm not sure if you're asking me if that mount type is supported, or if you're having problems with it. Yeah, so you can mount a secret, just like you're doing, mount type secret. And you don't have to use, by the way, Dan, I don't believe you're going to need to use a Docker build kit equals 1, because that, like, build kit, if you're on any modern version of Docker made this year, there's multiple versions that have been released this year, all the versions now use build kit by default. So that Docker build kit environment variable probably isn't necessary unless you're using an old Docker version from years ago. So you can just use a Docker build. And the way you're going to know is if you try to use a Docker build and that mount type secret isn't there, then you know, if it fails the build, then you know you're using an old Docker, essentially. I don't think that would fail silently. I think it would actually. But yeah, that mount type secret is the way. If you need, for example, a Git repo token, a pat, like you said, and you need that during build time, I thought you needed it during runtime. So sorry, because those are two different things, right? In build time, the real issue is you don't want that secret to accidentally get stored forever in the image layers. That's why that mount type secret exists, is because it doesn't actually store that in the image layers. It's temporary. Yeah. Hopefully that answers your question, Dan. If it doesn't, give me some more questions. Yeah, that's one nice thing about Swarm, is that the secrets are easy and secure by default. Yeah. It really nailed that UX right out of the box. Like, that's one of the things I really loved about it. In fact, back when it was released, it was one of the arguments for why I wanted people to use Swarm over Kubernetes, because I knew a lot of people were not properly securing their Kubernetes. And even in Swarm, you can technically remove those keys. If you want to be super secure, you can remove those keys from the hard drive so that at rest, the database, there's no way to access it. So every time you reboot the server, you technically have to go in and unlock the stuff. I don't know anybody that really did that, but it was a neat feature that was very easy to use for not providing the startup decryption key on disk. And that, I mean, that in and of itself is really a very clean UX for helping people stay secure and even super secure if they need to. And it sadly, I know the team that actually built that, and they don't work at Docker anymore, but there was a really great security team early on that really thought long and hard about safe, secure, encrypted by default Swarm, and they built that. They actually, I think they were a team that came out of like Stripe or Square or something like that, and they were an entire security team of engineers, and they all got hired by Docker, and none of them work there, I don't think, anymore, but that was like 6 or 7 years ago. I don't know about age on SecQ. I've not heard of that. Actually, good encryption. It's interesting. Yeah, it would be neat if I could see a working example of that. We have all that in our code base encrypted in Git and decrypt before deployment. So instead of using sealed secrets, you're using something else, AGE. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, I'm not seeing that tool yet. Leonardo, great question on LastPass. To my knowledge, no. And in fact, we've had so many problems with LastPass and their security. Maybe you don't have control over the fact that you have to use LastPass, but I would strongly discourage using LastPass. I used to use them. I was a very big advocate. I had a lot of clients. I moved them to LastPass. And then over the last 4 years or so, as they've been bought and sold multiple times, their quality has gone downhill, and they've had multiple security announcements that really expose the fact that they are not doing well in terms of handling their own security. So I've lost faith in them. And if you're interested in that story, go look up Security Now podcast. Absolutely my favorite podcast, Security Now. And Steve Gibson, who is, I think, one of the heroes of the internet, he and Leo Laporte run this podcast. And if you go into their history and look up the LastPass saga, you can definitely find out. In fact, I think they just recently talked more about it this week or last week, because even more bad information came out about the breaches at LastPass. So, but to answer your question, I moved from LastPass to 1Password. I moved my company, I moved my clients, I moved my family, and I have no complaints about 1Password. It largely is the same experience as LastPass, only better, and has way more functionality and modern approaches. My understanding with LastPass, and I could be wrong, is that they never went to offer developers solutions. They only offered for end users and enterprise, non-techies. And whereas 1Password eventually started supporting SSH key storage for your shells, and then they offered a command line tool that allowed you to redact and remove keys in your command line. Then they offered Kubernetes operator and this whole 1Password Connect. So they're going after the servers and machine world, and I'm not aware that LastPass did anything like that. So I even had one of the Vault Vault is a very popular tool, right? And I had one of the Vault team members from HashiCorp on last year, and we talked about that. Vault and HashiCorp are not building, or have no plans to extend it to support human keys, right? For us that are typing in command lines and browsers. So they're just a machine secrets tool, and that I wouldn't be surprised if the new trend is tools like 1Password that support machine keys as well as human keys, because a lot of times they're the same key. A lot of times in order for me to use something locally, I have to get a key, and that's the same key my server might need. So it's a similar problem with two different use cases, but a similar infrastructure requirement of safe keys stored securely, decrypted safely, temporarily on disk or never on disk. So I really like 1Password's approach. The challenge of it with 1Password is now you've got all these keys all in the same solution. So you really have to ratchet up your security in 1Password, making sure that you're following all the best practices. And at least with 1Password, they're largely doing that. Like everything I see on the engineering side of 1Password gives me confidence. For example, they're already better than LastPass because they require a unique key to log in, essentially, that you can't. You need your username, your password, and a unique key the first time you log in from somewhere. And that's not true of 1Password. 1Password doesn't require that extra level of something you have, something you know, something you have, and then something that another device has. So like with 1Password, you essentially need an existing device to add a new one because you got to get that key from it. And so it's already, in my mind, a little bit safer than LastPass, because LastPass you can technically get into with a username and password if you set it up a certain way without two-factor. All it needs is username and password. Whereas 1Password doesn't even allow that as a possibility. You have to have that third factor in order to use it. Anyway, I could talk about passwords all day, but go check out the Security Now podcast. It's great. I love it. Zafar, Docker network and how the load balancer worked. So the Docker networks, if we're just talking about Docker, not Swarm, Docker networks are really just using the built-in kernel features of Linux. So it's using a virtual Ethernet interface for each container that's created on the Linux host. One of the reasons that you need administrator rights, like root normally, for Docker to run, because it has to create these VESs, these virtual Ethernet interfaces. And so it creates fake IPs on fake interfaces. And then when you create multiple replicas, like in a Swarm overlay network, an overlay is something a little bit additional. I'm going to skip the fact that the overlay protocol and how it works and how it encapsulates packets inside packets. But the load balancer, when you say that, I'm assuming you mean Swarm. And the load balancer in Swarm is simply an IP on the local machine inside a virtual Ethernet interface, a VETH, and it uses IP tables to send the packets in round robin style, or not the packets, but the connections. So on the first connection, the local kernel on your Linux machine that receives the connection will look at the IP rules, the IP filter rules, and it will say, oh, there's a list here, and that list is kept up to date by Docker, and that's a list of IP addresses that might be on that local machine and might be on a different machine in a Swarm, and it will send each new connection to the next one in the list. So it just sends that connection there, sends that connection to that one, sends that connection to that one, and then when it runs out of the list, it starts to list over. That's how I understand it to work in the kernel. So it's very simple. It's using built-in default Kubernetes kernel, Linux kernel features. And with a Swarm, the overlay driver essentially adds another kernel feature functionality that allows us to wrap those packets that are sitting back and forth between the containers, but wrap it in something that we can then send over to a different server and then unwrap it, and it will have the correct IP in that original packet of the container on that other server. And it's a little bit, that's why it's called overlay. That's actually a feature of networking, is overlay typically encapsulates packets in other packets and sends them between hosts and then unwraps them and then sends them. That's why there's a little bit of a lag. So, for example, in a swarm overlay network, you get 10 to 20 millisecond lag, I think, on average. Well, you get 10 to 20. Sorry, you get 10 to 20% additional overhead in your packet transmission. So if it's only taking 10 milliseconds for that packet to get there, then in theory it would be 11 or 12 milliseconds. Again, in theory, your mileage may vary. So if that load balancer is not sophisticated, has no configuration options, and when you're doing it inside a Docker network without Swarm, there really isn't a load balancer. The only thing you're really doing in a standard Docker network with a bridge driver is when you create multiple aliases for different containers on that network to have the same name, you're really just doing DNS round robin, which happens to work in most browser clients. All the browser clients I've ever tested all support round robin. For example, if you go to google.com in your browser, the DNS for that google.com for your computer has multiple IPs that resolve to that name. And your browser will pick the first one just randomly. And it picks one, and if the website doesn't come up, then it goes to the next one. And your browser's smart enough to actually in the background try the next IP because maybe the first one's down or broken. And that just so happens to be the way that Docker bridge networks work, where that's a DNS round robin. And so that's the client, whether that's a curl command line tool or a browser, the client has to know that and know how DNS round robin works, which is a standard thing that's used all over the internet. So yes, the load balancer isn't that sophisticated. It's nothing like an Nginx proxy or a traffic proxy or anything like that, but it works well on a single host or on a small swarm. So hopefully that helps. I'm just catching up on chat. Yeah, on Q. Polishing your environment workflow somewhere on GitHub for Swarm people in 2023. Well, if we're going to have that Swarm meetup at DockerCon, if you end up doing it in the next 3 weeks, then I can make sure that the word gets out. We can put it inside this awesome Swarm list. Yeah, Nubu. I don't know how to say that. Nubo. Nubuo. Not sure how many syllables are there. Anyway, because my family was also on LastPass. I think they like and can understand 1Password a little bit better. It's a little bit prettier UI, a little bit more refined. I always felt like LastPass was very basic and left something to be desired. So hopefully you're able to win that argument over eventually. But at least with LastPass, at least if you follow the rules of enable the 2-factor for it and enforce that, and then make sure that the password you use in LastPass is not only long, but that it's never used anywhere else. So if it's at least, let's say it's at least 15 characters, preferably 20 characters, then you're going to avoid any brute force at that point, especially with 20. And then if you have that second factor, there are settings in your account that you can make sure that your family members are enabling. It's a lot of settings in there. So if you go through there, there's a lot of account settings. And if you can go through and try to harden a little bit of that. For example, did you know if you ever log into a particular machine with LastPass one time, any other machine, if anyone else wants to get into your account, they can use stuff inside the cache and the cookies of that computer where you logged in one time, assuming they're still there and you didn't use incognito, they can use stuff to help get into your account. So you would never want to log into it from an untrusted account. I think they may have fixed this vulnerability, but it was announced, 3 or 4 years ago that this was a weakness that was discovered in the way, and the reason their argument for this was It was to help people avoid getting locked out of their account when they forgot their password, that they could go to any other machine they've ever used and they could recover if they forgot their password. And it doesn't store your password, but it stores this key that means if you need to recover and create a new password, that you can use that machine to do so. The problem is they never told anybody that. Like, we didn't know that this secret recovery key. But if you go into the settings of LastPass, you will find there's this little option. It's like, I don't remember what it says anymore, but it used to say something like, allow storing recovery key on this computer or all computers or something like that. Anyway, it was a sneaky little setting that was meant to help people recover, but for the rest of us, I really feel like it just did was it just made the rest of us less secure. I think you still had to have access to your email account, but the reality is if someone's, once someone has access to your email account, if the reality is if they get on your machine and your email's already up and now they can get in, that, if your LastPass is locked down and they can't get in your 1Password, but your login is still working on that system, they can technically, now with just having your inbox, they can get back into your LastPass account even without having your LastPass password, as long as they have access to the machine where you once logged into LastPass and your email address. So it was a back door that I felt like, oh, great, here's another one. Here's another way someone can get my data, even if I try to stay super secure. That's the one thing I like about 1Password is that, to my knowledge, even if they get access to my inbox somehow, and they have my physical machine that has access to that inbox, they can't get into my 1Password unless my 1Password has cached, like it's still within the window. And I think with the default settings of 1Password, it actually sets it up so that the minute you lock your computer, I think with the default, or like the minute you log out or lock it or something, that you have to re-authenticate the next time. So I think it's a much safer. And now with, it supports Touch ID on Mac, and I think it supports Hello on Windows for the visual Face ID. So it's a little bit easier to get back into. It's not a huge deal of having to type in your master password every time. So you're welcome, Leonardo. I appreciate it. Thanks for the questions. Yes, Bitwarden is another great one. Thanks, Greg, for mentioning that. Bitwarden is another solid solution. I had moved to 1Password before I felt confident in Bitwarden's future. And it's, to me right now, I know a lot of techies that prefer Bitwarden. They like to host it themselves and not pay for a SaaS, because I do pay for 1Password. For 1Password. I do pay whatever it is, $30 a year for the Pro or whatever the family package is. So all my family members can have 1Password on one account. Like, basically they all get their own accounts, but I pay one time every year. I think it's, $50 or something, $70 for the whole family. Yeah, but Bitwarden, I know a lot of people use that, and you can host it for free on your own stuff, so you don't have to pay anyone. I think that's a really cool option. I do find that Bitwarden is a little less refined and a little more geeky, which is totally fine. Like, open source is normally like that, so that's a thing if you're a techie. But I was worried about getting my parents and my brother and all these people in my family who are not techies. I was a little worried about getting them onboarded with Bitwarden versus 1Password, so I ended up choosing 1Password because I thought it would be an easier, normal human implementation. But that was years ago. I made that decision 4 or 5 years ago, so that may not be true anymore. Another weird thing about LastPass, not to keep beating the LastPass drum, but I was trying to delete. So one of the things, I was moving off LastPass and I was trying to get rid of my accounts because I didn't want my stuff stored there anymore. And they made it very hard to make sure that not only was I deleting all of because I had a company with 3 or 4 accounts, and it made them, it was one thing to delete the accounts, but then once I deleted the accounts, they were trying to still charge me for the accounts that I didn't have anymore. And then when I contacted them about making sure the accounts were gone, I got this weird reply that was, and it was in bad English. So it definitely wasn't AI made. It was made by a human, but they were not a native English speaker. And it said something about, and these were paid accounts, paid pro plan accounts. And it was something about, it's a problem with our billing system that we, you don't have. So I didn't have an account, so I couldn't log in to check the billing details, which was super weird. So I had to find a page, and every support page on their website wanted you to log in first to contact support, which I couldn't because I had deleted my account. But I was getting these bills saying, we're going to invoice you, we're going to bill you, we're going to charge your credit card. And so I had to spend several days working with support on making sure, hey, you're not going to charge me, right? Because I don't have an account. And eventually they figured it out. And the argument I got was our billing system is separate than our account system, and there was a manual disconnect or something. I didn't care. All I knew was you suck. This is, figure it out. You should know better. I mean, why are you making it so hard for me to reach out to you and find you? I had to Google essentially for a way to find them that didn't require logins, because nothing on their website would let you do anything without logging in. So my relationship with them did not end on a good note. And so it did not give me confidence that they were going to do better. So currency, I had to install Colima. Why do you use Oracle XE? Why do companies like Oracle have images that are not available for Docker desktop? Currency, I'm not sure what you mean by that. Are you saying they're not on Docker Hub? Because that is common for other larger enterprises like Oracle or Microsoft. They don't technically store their images all the time on Docker Hub. And that makes sense. They're very big, multi-billion-dollar companies. They don't want to be beholden to Docker Hub. So they would rather have their own policies and their own bandwidth and their own guarantees on their own system and not have to worry about a third party in that way. And I get it. Is that what you're talking about? Or I'm not sure what you mean by images not available for Docker Desktop. Because Docker Desktop can run any container image that you can pull from anywhere as long as you log into it. So help me out. Give me a better, some more details on that, and I'll try to help you, Currency. Yes. The problem is the chat is 30 seconds lagged, so unfortunately I don't know what you were saying yes to. But let me know if that helps. Okay. Let's wrap this up. So assuming that I've answered Currency's question, this is last call. This is last call for questions in this wonderful almost 2 hours. We'll quit at the end of 2 hours. Chat. So just to remind you real quick, this happens every Thursday, and you can come back every Thursday, hang out with me live, ask your questions. We have guests every other week. So next week we're going to have another guest on. Let me go look up what that is. I believe next week's guest is going to be Multipass from Canonical. So Ubuntu, the Multipass tool for installing Ubuntu locally on your machine. The Multipass team, Chris from that team, will be on to talk about the newest features in Multipass. It's one of my favorite ways to run virtual machines locally. That's going to be next week. And then we've got another Q&A the week after that. And the week after that, I'll be at DockerCon. So we are hopefully going to do a live stream from DockerCon, bandwidth permitting. And then, yes, hallway track. So I don't know officially about the hallway track. As far as I know, it will be accepted. I actually told them that if the Swarm hallway track isn't accepted, we're probably going to do it anyway. And it'll just be in a literal hallway somewhere without a dedicated space. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to pronounce his name wrong. I apologize. Sidarshan. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Thank you so much for the super chat. I appreciate it. Zolt's like, what? .NET, NuGet packages, and OCI registry. Yeah. So I mean, I don't know all the tools. Like that, this is a ways off where I'm predicting. So the short answer there is make sure you're on my newsletter. That's Bret.news. So, and last week's newsletter, I talked about OCI registries. I'm talking again about it this week and next week. And what could be the future of universal package management storage, which means, doesn't guarantee, but it means that eventually we could see things like Ruby packages, NPM packages, .NET packages, WinGet, NuGet, all these different client tools could possibly support OCI registries as a universal storage system for their artifacts, their data objects. And that means that we could have one standard that any tool, any generic command line tool can opt into storing their stuff there rather than their own proprietary API and package manager format. For example, Homebrew has now done this. Since 2021, Homebrew has stored or supported storing their images in GitHub Container Registry as OCI artifacts. So now when you do brew install, chances are on Mac, a lot of those brew installs are technically just command line utilities coming out of an image registry. So what we're hoping for is that the industry will rally behind this and that other tools will find it easier or more useful to just support OCI registries rather than their own custom solution. We shall see, right? We've got Helm supports it now. We've got other tools like Cosign and Cores and like all these different tools around containers that are container related. The question is, will non-container tooling start to adopt it even more and more? Homebrew was one of the leaders where they have a lot, they do terabytes of downloads a day to store stuff on Mac and Linux. I don't think there's a Homebrew for Windows other than WSL2 supports Homebrew. I think it does. So anyway, yeah, so it remains to be seen whether other package tools will start to support the new OCI specification. But check out my newsletter for more details on that. Oh, yeah, that's good. Yeah, passkeys, Conrad. We didn't even talk about passkeys, which, yeah, I mean, it's cool. Like, use your, I don't need a dedicated USB chip anymore. I can just use my phone, right? I can use my phone as the key that's my third factor, and essentially I can Face ID for all my logins now, even not on Apple stuff, right? So it's a cool standard. I never was someone who adopted the third factor. I always used like Google. I use 1Password's two-factor, which is a replacement for Google Authenticator. So that was always my third factor. Anyway. Yeah. So thanks everyone for the chat. Hopefully I answered your questions today, and I will see you next week here on YouTube Live. Ciao, everybody.